Rowing is one of the earliest traditions in Cornell history. Like I said, baseball claims to be the first sport, but rowing, I think, has the most important history. And it arguably helped establish Cornell's reputation. It helped establish Cornell as a legitimate university amongst what we now call the Ivy League. In many ways, rowing helped put Cornell on the map nationally, and conversely, Cornell helped elevate rowing on a national level too. So some of you might be familiar with Andrew Dixon White, Cornell's first president, but what you might not know is that he was a rower. So Cornell started with a little bit of a rowing tradition. He rowed as a student at Yale University when he was an undergraduate. And this was before intercollegiate athletic competition had begun. So sports were for recreation, were mostly intramural, not intercollegiate at this point. And at the end of White's junior year at Yale in 1852, that was when Yale and Harvard rowed against each other for the first time. That was the very first intercollegiate athletic event in US history, in any sport. So Yale was able, or Andrew Dixon White was able to view that while he was a student at Yale. He didn't row in that first regatta, but his rowing at Yale definitely influenced his support of athletics more broadly at Cornell. He later wrote that my own experience as a member of a boating club at Yale has shown me what could be done. And I think one of the best investments I ever made was giving a racing boat to the Cornell crew on Cayuga Lake. So in his many years as president, he thought one of his best investments ever was supporting crew at Cornell. And so in 1871, Cornell's third year of operation, that was when two student boating clubs were formed, the first boating clubs at Cornell, inspired in part by a visit from a famous English politician, novelist, and Oxford rower, a guy named Thomas Hughes. And despite limited experience, limited skills, and very little equipment, student enthusiasm for rowing was high. And they raised money to build this first boathouse in 1871, this sort of ramshackle structure, and that housed their first three boats. They had a 6-oared blue and white striped barge called the Striped Pig, an 8-oared barge called the Cornell, and a 4-oared outrigger called the Buffalo, and that's what they were working with in those early years. And the following year, 1872, was when the first regatta between Cornell's two boating clubs took place, and they invited other Ithaca competitors as well, including a high school student named Robert Treeman, who would soon enter Cornell, become a noted trustee, local businessman, and later the namesake of Treeman Park locally. Several rowers in this first regatta broke their oars, the Striped Pig took on water and sank, and the first race was considered more of a practice than a real competition. But on day 2 of this regatta, Cornell students took on their first official competitor, and that was a crew from Union Springs at the north end of the lake. Cornell lost, but that Union Springs crew included a man named Charles Courtney, who will return to Cornell history shortly, and I'll talk a little bit more about him. 1872 was also the first year that Cornell's yearbook included athletics as a separate section. You can see the athletics section of that yearbook here. The Cornell Navy is listed, and its various crews took up 3 pages. There was a university crew, a university barge crew, various class crews, and there's crews listed for 4 oars, 6 oars, 8 oars, as well as single scullers in that first yearbook with an athletics section. And the second page of the yearbook, or the second section of the athletics part of the yearbook, listed the Tom Hughes Boat Club, one of these first 2 clubs, and the Alpha Delta Phi Yacht Club, because even back then, Alpha Delta Phi members were apparently stereotyped as owning yachts. The Tom Hughes Boat Club soon merged into the Cornell Navy, so these 2 early boat clubs combined, although Tom Hughes Boat Club still considered themselves the oldest and first rowing organization at Cornell. But now we have the Cornell Navy collectively formed in that year, 1872. And in 1873, Cornell decides it's going to take rowing seriously. It enters the Rowing Association of American Colleges, and it needed to compete intercollegiately as a member of that association. And a professional coach was hired for the first time. President White donates a cedar shell to the crew that I referenced earlier, and crew is off and running at Cornell. Unfortunately, the new coach wasn't great. He was a single-scull national champion named Harry Coulter, but he had some questionable methods of coaching. He wanted all the rowers to drop 25 pounds immediately, which meant hours of midday running in flannel and sweaters and sleeping under piles of winter blankets. And rowers were limited to how much water they could drink. They were allotted 1 glass of water for breakfast, 2 for lunch, and 1 at dinner, and that was all the water they could have during the day. And so rowers could easily be spotted on campus by their weakened state and apparently unhealthy boils all over their skin. That's how you knew if someone was on the rowing team back then. Needless to say, the crews of 1873 and 1874 did not perform particularly well. Cornell was also criticized for hiring a professional coach, because this was a time when you had student coaches. It was unusual to employ a non-student coach. That was not yet the norm. And then the Rowing Association banned the practice because of Cornell, so Harry Coulter left after his first few seasons. But Cornell did start a crew tradition of looking super stylish in their team photos. It goes all the way back to 1873, and a tradition that continues. I mean, just look at these guys. They're great. So this is the 1875 crew here. You can see the outfits got considerably more revealing after Coach Coulter left, and a little more comfortable. They aren't wearing heavy wool outfits here. The new leader of the team was a student named John Ostrom, and he was elected captain in 1874. That's Ostrom in the upper left of this photo. And his first change was letting rowers drink as much water as they would like. He got rid of the grueling training regimen and developed a nationally competitive crew. He even invited that Union Springs crew with Charles Courtney back to test the speed of his Cornell crew, and Cornell won this time. So Cornell crew was back to some winning ways at this point. And in July of 1875, Cornell entered the Saratoga Regatta against the best crews in the country. And Cornell shocked the collegiate rowing world by defeating the likes of Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and others at this race. You can see this is an artistic interpretation of the race. Cornell's crew is at the front, Columbia, Harvard, Dartmouth trailing behind. And Cornellians in attendance went wild. They swarmed the water, they carried the Cornell crew to the grandstand. When word of the victory reached Ithaca via telegram, students allegedly rushed to the clock tower to ring the bells in celebration. And legend persists that President White himself was the one who led the charge and rung the bells on campus, but he insists he was merely following the student mob to make sure they treated the bells with care, and wasn't the one who rung them himself. He did telegraph to Saratoga back that the university chimes are ringing, flags are flying, and cannons firing. So that was how big a deal this was, that Cornell's crew had finally won a major intercollegiate race. When the crew arrived back in Ithaca, most of the town showed up to welcome them. There was a huge celebration. This 50-foot arch was built near campus solely for the welcome back parade, and rowers were paraded from downtown on a ladder truck from the fire department up to campus. So this was a big deal. President White announced that the rowers had done more to tell the world about Cornell University than the trustees could have done by spending $100,000. Which was probably true. This event put Cornell on the map. Almost overnight, Cornell became the capital of the collegiate rowing world. The win was covered in newspapers, magazines around the country. Here you can see the cover of a popular magazine with members of Cornell's crew there. And Cornell wins at Saratoga again the next year in 1876. And then the Rowing Association dissolves. Yale quits and Harvard follows. They decided they'd rather just compete against each other instead of losing to the uncivilized farmers and engineers of Cornell. The New York Times noted that certain colleges were, quote, retiring from a conflict in which apparently they consider they have no chance. And so that was the end of the Rowing Association. Harvard and Yale decided we're just going to take our ball and go home and not row against Cornell anymore. The Cornell crew, unfortunately, didn't maintain the same level of success in the following years, but they still had some epic team photos. I particularly like this one from 1879. That's John Ostrom in the middle with the oar, acting as coach. He's still helping out even though he graduated the previous year. The crew did make its first overseas trip in 1881, competing at Henley for the first time. Also rode some other races in London and in Vienna, Austria, but didn't do particularly well in any of those races. But rowing's major turning point was in 1883 when they hired Charles Courtney, probably the most important moment in the team's history. He spent 10 days coaching the team in 1883 and then would continue in this part-time capacity for several years until being appointed to a permanent position in 1889. And at the time, Courtney was considered one of the best professional rowers ever. He'd only lost 7 of 46 races in his career. He broke many records. His success had led to some controversies, including accusations of fixing races at one point. And once again, Cornell was criticized for hiring a professional to coach the team. When he was hired, the New York Times editorialized, "If college boys cannot learn to row without associating with persons like Courtney, perhaps they would be quite as well off if they devoted a little more time to classics and mathematics and a little less to rowing." But Courtney ends up staying at Cornell until his death in 1920, which is nearly 50 years after he first defeated Cornell in that very first regatta. And his legacy and an impact on rowing and on intercollegiate athletics more broadly would be enormous. Cornell dominated during the Courtney era. The team won all 14 races it rowed from 1885 to 1892. It won 14 of 24 IRA championships during Courtney's time. And in 1890, Cornell opened its new boathouse on the inlet. This one pictured here, and you can actually see the original sign from this boathouse at the entrance of this one. If you look downstairs, you can see the original 1890 sign. And this was the boathouse for the team. This was the home until the Collier Boathouse opened in 1958, so for many years. Courtney was an early proponent of the student-athlete philosophy. He really wanted students to prioritize academics over athletics. And you heard how today's students, they are student athletes. They are well-rounded students. And that was something Courtney thought was really important. He said, "The best students make the best oarsmen. Students go to Cornell primarily to secure an education. Their athletic sports must be subordinate to that purpose." He famously kicked a student off the team when he overheard that they had cheated on an exam and told them to leave the boathouse immediately. And in 1897, when he found out that his first boat had broken training rules by eating strawberry shortcake, he put in a team of all substitutes and still won the Poughkeepsie Regatta. And the famous strawberry shortcake crew would long be remembered for its victory after he kicked out all of the first boat. He also brought an academic perspective to rowing that was pretty unusual at the time. He was among the first of coaches to apply principles of engineering to the sport. He took advantage of the engineering expertise that Cornell had due to the College of Engineering, and he helped design early ergs. This is a blueprint for an erg that he worked with folks in the engineering college to design. He also photographed rowers to better analyze their technique and understand what they were doing right or wrong, and that was rare at the time. And one of his big innovations was connecting an apparatus up to the rowers to measure the force applied during each stroke. And when the result looked something like this, he began to develop a new stroke that would even out the force applied during each stroke, so it would look more like this in the end. And the Courtney stroke, or Cornell stroke, ended up influencing dozens of coaches and teams around the country. Cornell became legendary for its unique stroke that Courtney had developed. Another important legacy of the Courtney era was his emphasis on rowing for everyone and creating an inclusive culture in an era when that was pretty unusual in collegiate athletics. His efforts resulted in the development of women's crew as one of the very first women's teams at Cornell. Although men's athletics were independently funded and organized separately from the university, women's athletics fell under the physical education curriculum and were more part of the university. And the university hired a woman named Ellen Canfield in 1894 who led this effort for decades. But she was a mentee of Charles Courtney, and Courtney would actually welcome the women's rowers to his home to use his ergs and his equipment as the early women's crew began to develop. A women's athletic association was founded in 1896, originally called the Sports and Pastimes Association, later renamed the Women's Athletic Association. And their first three teams, the first three official women's teams at Cornell, were basketball, tennis, and boating. A women's boathouse was built on the shore of Beebe Lake in 1900, pictured here. And so that's just a few years after that Women's Athletic Association was founded. And this was the first facility for women's athletics in Cornell history. Keep in mind, this is during a period where it was still controversial whether women would even attend college, especially at a coeducational institution like Cornell. Most of the Ivy League were still not admitting women at this point, and Cornell had women's athletics. Serious intercollegiate competition, partly because of that, for women is still decades away at this point. Although by the time Title IX passes in 1972, Cornell was already fielding the second most women's varsity teams of any college in the nation. Other schools would finally begin to catch up in the 1970s. Women also had use of the rowing practice room in the campus gymnasium, which was located on today's engineering quad until it was demolished in the 1950s. And then finally, in 1979, pressure from Title IX led to the construction of the Doris Robeson Boathouse on the inlet for women's crew, so they finally had a facility on the inlet at that point. Here's Charles Courtney with the women's crew of 1897, along with the men's varsity coxswain Frederick Colson in the upper left. He would actually stay at Cornell as Courtney's assistant for decades and serve as Harvard's head coach for one season. And you can see the outfits are a little less comfortable and flexible compared to the men's crew uniforms. The women's crew had these heavy woolen outfits, which was considered more appropriate for women than the men's outfits. Those early women's teams included some of Cornell's most notable alumni of the era. Seated in the middle here, that's Emily Dunning Beringer, the first American woman with a surgical residency and the first woman ambulance surgeon in the United States. She successfully lobbied Congress to grant women doctors military commissions for their service in the Army Medical Reserves. And behind her is Nan Gilbert Seymour, another pioneer for women in medicine who directed New York's William Booth Memorial Hospital. Another women's rower of this era who isn't pictured here was Mary Crawford, who became Brooklyn's first female ambulance surgeon and one of the first American women to hold Army rank after she was given a commission by the French government in World War I. So a lot of women going into medicine coming from Cornell's crew at a time when women's crew and women in medicine were particularly rare. And here's a shot of women on the inlet with those bulky wool rowing outfits and also wearing mortarboards. At the time, students would sometimes wear their graduation mortarboards during the spring semester, not just at graduation, although this might have been a special senior crew photo that they were taking here. In this boat is Frances Keller, one of the first women to graduate from Cornell's law school. She became a nationally influential social reformer and advocate for women, immigrants, and the incarcerated, and she actually helped write Teddy Roosevelt's presidential campaign platform. So a lot of really notable women in the 19th century rowing at Cornell. The woman in the fourth seat here married the assistant coach, Frederick Colson. And Courtney's focus on making rowing accessible for everyone created a huge intramural rowing program at Cornell, another pretty unusual thing at the time. People wanted to row whether they were competing intercollegiately or not. And this image shows Charles Courtney working with two blind students who likely would not have received the opportunity to row on a crew at another school, but Charles Courtney gave them encouragement and attention and coaching. Of course, my favorite photo of the women's crew is this one from 1903. They chose to dress like men for their team photo, mocking their place in what was seen as a men's world of athletics. And they're also partaking in alcohol and tobacco, if you look closely, breaking the strictly enforced training rules for the crews at Cornell. And in some ways, the photo is representative of Cornell's proud tradition of women trailblazers, rule breakers, and rebels against convention, which the early crew certainly was. Rowing in the Courtney era and the early 20th century was the collegiate sport. It was a huge spectator sport, and people here are set up on bleachers that were on railroad cars. This was an observation train car that would go along the tracks up the lake. And would follow alongside of the regattas on Cuba Lake. And so this was a huge event. The whole town would turn out, sit on these bleachers on the railway observation train and watch the regatta. And here you can see another shot of that with the cars lined up along the road and huge crowds on the railway observation train. Thousands of people would show up for these events. And sadly, the last observation train ran in 1936, so it's been a while. That was actually the first year that legendary coach Stork Sanford took over the team. Though I should note that the crew didn't always get the VIP treatment. Here's a team bus from 1923. Accommodations for traveling to regattas have improved a little bit over the years. It was also Pop Courtney who began the tradition of breaking up ice on the inlet for rowing season. Courtney's tool of choice was dynamite. Without securing any necessary permits or legal permissions, he would quietly take the matter into his own hands and blast through the ice with explosives acquired at his own expense. And it was said that some of the fish casualties that resulted from these activities were allegedly delivered to local officials like the mayor and chief of police as bribes to look the other way and allow Coach Courtney to continue dynamiting the inlet. In 1927, he had the crew rowing as early as, I guess it wasn't Courtney at that point, but the coach in 1927 had the crew rowing as early as February 11th, which I think was the earliest they had gotten out in that point. And one more note on Courtney's legacy. Courtney really helped create the modern concept of a collegiate coach. Before that was the norm. He transitioned power and authority away from the student-led team and student coaches. And not only did he have a huge impact at Cornell, his influence nationally on other crew programs is significant. Edwin Sweetland, Cornell class of 1899, became the first official rowing coach at Syracuse University, building a nationally competitive program with what he learned under Courtney's leadership. At the University of Wisconsin, the first non-student crew coach was Amos Marston, a former Cornell captain from the class of 1892. And Mark Odell from Cornell's 1897 IRA championship team helped develop the University of Washington Huskies program, bringing Courtney's techniques and ideas to the West Coast. He purchased the first 2 shells from Cornell for the team in 1906. He stayed engaged as a volunteer assistant coach for years. And of course, the Huskies are best known for being the inspiration for the boys in the boat after their 1936 Olympic victory. So 3 programs that really started based on Charles Courtney's techniques with some of his apprentices over the years. One more particular crew anecdote is the story of the 1895 Henley Regatta crew. This was Cornell's second major appearance on the international stage, and expectations were high for the Cornell crew. But unfortunately, it resulted in what might be considered a diplomatic incident. In their first race, the English crew from the Leander Club was heavily favored to win, but the umpire signaled the start of the race before the English crew was ready. And so the Leander Club stopped rowing, and Cornell kept going when the umpire didn't signal for them to stop. And the Leander Club protested the victory, and Cornell ends up being criticized as unsportsmanlike and heavily attacked by the British press. And some have argued that the tensions that arose from this were also due to the Cornell crew being kind of serious and more disciplined than the British crews. The atmosphere in England around rowing was a much more relaxed, sociable attitude, and the Cornell crew might have been seen as a little uptight and not friendly compared to the British. But whatever the reason was, Cornell ends up being horribly attacked. They end up losing the semifinal race to Trinity Hall, who goes on to win the cup. And it ends up being a difficult time for rowing. What you might not know about that story is that the Cornell Glee Club, the men's choir at Cornell, had traveled to England with the crew for a concert tour to accompany them and help out. But the bad press from Henley ends up getting half of their performances canceled by the venues, and they end up abandoning their concert tour that they planned. So all of these Cornell singers are stranded in London without enough money to return home. And so in the Cornell musical history, the Henley Regatta of 1895 is considered a particularly important moment where their first international tour gets stranded in London thanks to bad press because of the crew. Of course, Cornell eventually does get its Henley victory in 1957, winning the Grand Challenge Cup, making the cover of Cornell Alumni News pictured here. I think we have one of those rowers here this weekend. Is Carl in the room? All right, there he is. A legendary crew. Where are you pictured in the photo here?
Not the rower.
You're not the rower. Oh, okay, got it. On the topic of magazine covers, you can see this cover when you enter the facility. Cornell's 1962 crew is the only varsity team to ever appear on the cover of Sports Illustrated. There have only been 14 Cornellians to make the cover of Sports Illustrated, and 9 of them are right here on this cover. Do we have any of those 9 in the room? No one from the Sports Illustrated cover here, okay. And it makes it all the more frustrating that when the women's crew won the IRA championship in 1989, they only appeared on page 8 of the Cornell Alumni News. Here's the photo of that. Do we have any of the IRA champions from women's crew here, 1989? No? Okay. Cornell lightweight crew also has their own Henley Regatta win 10 years after the heavyweight victory. That only got mentioned on page 30 of the Cornell Daily Sun, though. Do we have anyone here from the lightweight Henley Regatta crew? All right. They may have been on page 30, but they did have the coveted next to the crossword placement, so may have gotten more attention than some of the other headlines. While nearly all of Cornell's early crews could be classified as lightweight crews today, the official lightweight distinction on collegiate rowing begins in 1919. And Cornell is actually one of the first schools to enter the sport, 150-pound rowing as it was usually called then. The team was not really given the attention or resources of the heavyweight crews for many years, and lightweight rowers didn't receive varsity letters until 1931, when they are officially recognized by Cornell's Athletic Association. And because the Cornell Athletic Association declined to help the team purchase a new shell, it was a big deal when they fundraised enough to buy a shell in 1951. The spirit of the 50s was that shell. And a decade later, they would go on to win 5 national titles in 6 years, and their tradition of success was firmly established by that point. So I'll wrap up with one last bit of important trivia that all Cornell rowers should know, and that's that the official ceremonial Cornell mace, which was first carried at the inauguration of Cornell's president in 1963, and you might see at commencement ceremonies these days. If you zoom in on that, it has a little bear on the top, and the bear is holding an oar. Crew is the only Cornell sport officially recognized by the symbol of university authority. So crew is clearly the most important sport if it's recognized on the official university mace there. So next time you see that at an official Cornell event, you can realize rowing is being acknowledged. So I'll wrap up just by saying thank you to everyone who organized this weekend, the coaches and Susan and others. It's really an honor to be part of this event, and congratulations on rowing's historic legacy at Cornell. Not only is Cornell's crew program, arguably the most successful program in the university's history and nationally influential, it's also a pioneer in promoting the student-athlete ideal, building an accessible and inclusive team atmosphere, and developing a close relationship across the men's and women's teams. And I think that's something that the program should really be proud of. And the program is what it is because of all of you as students and as alumni, the engagement that you've kept, being part of this facility and helping create the philosophy and traditions around this team. It's something that I think all of you should be proud of. As a Cornell historian, I'm deeply grateful for the contributions that all of you have made to Big Red Spirit. So congratulations on 150 years of Big Red rowing, and here's to 150 more. Thank you for including me.